There are moments in the long and turbulent history of our planet where everything nearly ended, where life itself teetered on the edge of a cliff so steep that one wrong gust of wind could have blown it all into oblivion. Tonight, we are going to explore those moments, the catastrophes, the plagues, the cosmic close calls, and the split-second human decisions that nearly erased humanity from existence. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the weight of these stories wash over you as we journey through the most terrifying near-extinction events that almost ended humanity. If you were to travel back in time roughly 66 million years, you would find yourself on a planet teeming with life on a scale that almost defies imagination. The Cretaceous period was a golden age of biological diversity, and the undisputed rulers of the Earth were the dinosaurs. Towering sauropods lumbered through forests of ferns and conifers, their necks craning toward treetops that swayed in warm tropical breezes. Tyrannosaurs patrolled the open plains, their massive jaws capable of crushing bone like paper. Overhead, pterosaurs soared through skies that hummed with the drone of insects. And beneath the waves, the ocean swarmed with mosasaurs and ammonites and giant marine reptiles that had no natural predator. It was a world of abundance, of ecosystems that had been evolving and diversifying for hundreds of millions of years, refining themselves into intricate webs of predator and prey, parasite and host, symbiont and competitor. And then, in a single afternoon, it was all over. Approximately 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter, about the size of a small city, came hurtling through the atmosphere at a speed of around 20 kilometers per second, which translates to over 40,000 miles per hour. It struck the shallow coastal waters off what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, near the modern-day town of Chicxulub. The impact released energy equivalent to more than 100 teratons of TNT, roughly 4.5 billion times the explosive power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In the first fractions of a second, the asteroid vaporized entirely. It punched through the ocean and into the bedrock beneath, blasting open a cavity over 100 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. Superheated winds exceeding 1,000 kilometers per hour radiated outward from the impact zone, shredding vegetation and incinerating animals for hundreds of miles in every direction. A wall of molten rock and debris was ejected into the upper atmosphere, some of it reaching as high as the edge of space before raining back down on the planet in a global firestorm. But the immediate devastation, as horrific as it was, paled in comparison to what came next. The impact launched billions of tons of dust, soot, and sulfur into the stratosphere, where it formed an opaque shroud that encircled the globe. Sunlight was blocked, and the Earth plunged into a prolonged period of darkness that some researchers estimate lasted for 2 years or more in certain regions. Temperatures dropped by as much as 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Photosynthesis ground to a halt. Plants died, then the herbivores that depended on them, then the predators that depended on the herbivores. The oceans acidified as sulfuric acid rained down from the poisoned skies, dissolving the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms. The food chain, both on land and in the sea, collapsed from the bottom up. By the time the dust finally settled, roughly 75% of all species on Earth had been extinguished, including every non-avian dinosaur. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how total the destruction was. In the shallow seas, the great ammonites, those coiled shell predators that had been successful for hundreds of millions of years, vanished entirely. On land, every animal weighing more than about 25 kilograms, or roughly 55 pounds, died, with the exception of a few cold-blooded species like crocodilians and sea turtles whose metabolisms allowed them to survive long periods without food. The forests of the Cretaceous, which had taken millions of years to develop their intricate structures, were reduced to ash and stumps. In their place, fern spores dominate the fossil record for the earliest years of the Paleogene period, a phenomenon scientists call the fern spike, which tells us that the only plants that could recolonize the scorched landscape were the hardiest and most opportunistic. The world that emerged from the darkness was unrecognizable from the one that had existed just a few years before. The Chicxulub impact left behind a crater approximately 200 kilometers, or about 120 miles, wide, now buried beneath hundreds of meters of sediment on the Yucatan seafloor. Scientists first proposed the asteroid theory in 1980, when physicist Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter discovered an unusually high concentration of the element iridium in a thin layer of clay found at the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods. Iridium is exceedingly rare in Earth's crust, but relatively abundant in asteroids, and the fact that this iridium layer appeared at locations all around the world told a chilling story. Something enormous had arrived from space and deposited its chemical fingerprint across the entire planet. It took another decade before the crater itself was confirmed, and researchers have been drilling into it and studying it ever since. What they have found paints a picture of a planet that very nearly lost everything. Only a handful of small, adaptable creatures survived, mostly burrowing mammals, some birds descended from the dinosaurs, and cold-blooded animals like crocodilians and sea turtles that could endure long periods without food. Those survivors, as improbable and fragile as they were, became the ancestors of every complex animal alive today, including us. Now, as devastating as Chicxulub was, it was not the worst mass extinction in Earth's history. That distinction belongs to an event so catastrophic that scientists have given it a grimly fitting nickname. Roughly 252 million years ago, long before the dinosaurs even existed, the Earth was a very different world. The continents were locked together in a single massive supercontinent called Pangaea, surrounded by a vast global ocean known as Panthalassa. Life had been flourishing for hundreds of millions of years. The oceans were thick with trilobites, brachiopods, crinoids, and ammonites. On land, the dominant creatures were the synapsids, a group of reptile-like animals that were actually the distant ancestors of modern mammals. Forests of ferns and conifers blanketed the landscape, and insects, including species as large as modern-day hawks, buzzed through the humid air. And then something went terribly, catastrophically wrong. Deep beneath the surface of what is now Siberia, a massive plume of molten rock began to push its way upward through the Earth's crust. When it finally broke through, it unleashed what geologists call the Siberian Traps, a series of volcanic eruptions so immense that they are almost impossible to comprehend. Over the course of roughly 1 million years, these eruptions poured out approximately 3 million cubic kilometers of lava, enough to bury all of the continental United States under a layer of molten rock more than 1 kilometer deep. The eruptions were not a single event, but a sustained geological convulsion, a wound in the Earth's surface that bled magma for hundreds of thousands of years, covering an area the size of Western Europe in hardened lava flows that can still be seen today. But the lava itself was almost beside the point. What made the Siberian traps so deadly was the staggering volume of toxic gases they pumped into the atmosphere. An estimated 100,000 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, along with massive quantities of sulfur dioxide, methane, and other noxious compounds. The magma also intruded into coal deposits and other organic-rich sedimentary rocks as it rose through the crust, which combusted on contact and released additional greenhouse gases and toxic chemicals in quantities that were, for all practical purposes, beyond calculation. The effects cascaded through the biosphere like a series of dominoes toppling in slow motion. Carbon dioxide and methane trapped heat in the atmosphere, triggering a greenhouse effect that raised global temperatures by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, or about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The warming oceans lost their ability to hold dissolved oxygen, and vast regions of the deep sea became anoxic, meaning they were essentially dead zones where nothing could survive. Sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to produce acid rain that fell across the planet, killing trees and poisoning freshwater ecosystems. The ozone layer was damaged, allowing harmful ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface, and there is evidence that plant spores from this period show elevated rates of mutation consistent with increased UV exposure. The result was the Permian-Triassic extinction event, known as the Great Dying, and for good reason. It killed approximately 90% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. It was the only known mass extinction of insects. Entire groups of animals that had existed for hundreds of millions of years, including the trilobites, were wiped off the face of the earth forever. In the ocean, roughly 96% of all marine species perished. The great reef ecosystems that had flourished for eons collapsed completely, and it would take millions of years before new reef-building organisms could evolve to fill the ecological void. The synapsids, those proto-mammals that had dominated the land for 60 million years, were decimated, their sprawling families reduced to a handful of surviving lineages. The world's forests died en masse, and researchers have found what they call a fungal spike in rocks from this period, an explosion in fungal remains that tells us the planet was essentially covered in rotting biomass. As one paleontologist memorably put it, you can imagine the entire Permian extinction by holding a soft brown banana in your hand and watching it decompose, because that was the state of the world, rotting biomass everywhere, as far as any eye could see. The recovery was agonizingly slow. For the first few million years of the Triassic period, the world was eerily empty, dominated by a single, squat, bulldog-like creature called Lystrosaurus that somehow managed to survive while almost everything else perished. There were no coal deposits laid down during this period, a phenomenon known as the coal gap, which tells us that there simply were not enough plants alive to produce the decaying matter from which coal is formed. The oceans were largely devoid of the complex ecosystems we take for granted, and it took approximately 5 million years for top predators to re-emerge in the marine food chain, and perhaps 50 million years for the full complexity of ocean ecosystems to rebuild. Eventually, life rebounded, and the empty ecological niches left behind by the Great Dying were filled by new groups of animals, including the archosaurs that would eventually give rise to the dinosaurs. But the Great Dying stands as a reminder of how close life on Earth has come to total annihilation, and it happened not because of a rock falling from the sky, but because of forces churning deep within the planet itself. Now let us move forward through time, past the age of the dinosaurs and their spectacular demise, past the slow rise of mammals and the eventual emergence of our own species, to an event that, while it did not threaten all life on Earth, may have come terrifyingly close to ending humanity before we ever really got started. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, a mountain that had been slowly building pressure for centuries finally gave way. The Toba supervolcano erupted with a force that ranks as an 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the highest possible rating, making it the most powerful volcanic eruption of at least the last 2.5 million years. To put its scale in perspective, the Toba eruption was more than 200 times larger than the largest volcanic event of the 20th century, and more than 11,000 times the size of the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. It dwarfed even the 3 largest known eruptions of the Yellowstone supervolcano, which itself is one of the most feared geological features on the North American continent. The eruption expelled an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, a volume so vast that it left behind a caldera so large it is now filled by Lake Toba, one of the deepest lakes in the world, stretching 100 kilometers in length. The energy released was equivalent to roughly 1 million tons of explosives, and the initial eruption column, formed by superheated pyroclastic flows that raced outward at hundreds of miles per hour, reached heights of more than 32 kilometers, punching well into the stratosphere. The eruption lasted perhaps 9 to 14 days, but its effects reverberated for years and perhaps centuries. Billions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide were injected into the stratosphere, creating a dense aerosol veil that partially blocked the sun's radiation. What followed was what scientists call a volcanic winter, a period of severe global cooling. Estimates vary, but many researchers believe that average global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, with some models suggesting the drop may have been as dramatic as 10 degrees Celsius in the northern hemisphere during the first year. In regions already on the edge of habitability, this would have been catastrophic. Forests withered, grasslands turned to tundra, and food sources for both animals and humans shrank dramatically. At the time, Homo sapiens were a relatively young species, having evolved in Africa perhaps 200,000 years earlier. Our ancestors were still primarily hunter-gatherers, living in small, widely scattered bands across the African continent, and in small numbers, beginning to venture into the Middle East and beyond. The Toba catastrophe theory, first proposed in the late 1990s, holds that the eruption and its climatic aftermath caused a population bottleneck in humans so severe that our species was reduced to as few as 1,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs. This idea was bolstered by genetic studies that showed remarkably low genetic diversity in modern humans compared to other great apes, a pattern that suggested our population had been squeezed through a very narrow window at some point in the relatively recent past. The theory remains debated. Some more recent archaeological evidence, particularly from sites in South Africa and Ethiopia, suggests that some human populations actually thrived during and after the eruption, adapting their tools and behaviors to cope with the changing environment. Researchers studying microscopic volcanic glass shards, called cryptotephra, at archaeological sites like Pinnacle Point on the South African coast, found that human occupation actually intensified after the eruption, with inhabitants developing technical innovations in their stone tools that persisted for thousands of years afterward. These tiny glass fragments, so small that you would need to line up 5 of them to match the diameter of a single human hair, served as geological timestamps that allowed researchers to compare human activity from before, during, and after the eruption with unprecedented precision. The South African coastline, with its rich marine resources, including shellfish, fish, and edible plants, may have served as a crucial refuge for our ancestors, a lifeline at the edge of a continent where the bounty of the sea provided sustenance even as the interior grew cold and barren. Still, the genetic evidence is hard to dismiss entirely. Studies of human mitochondrial DNA have confirmed that all modern humans descend from a population that was extraordinarily small at some point between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, and the low genetic diversity in our species compared to other great apes, including chimpanzees, remains a puzzle that demands explanation. Whether Toba truly pushed humanity to the very brink of extinction, or merely forced us to adapt and innovate, remains an open question. But what is clear is that around this time, the total number of humans on the planet was extraordinarily small by any measure, perhaps no more than a few tens of thousands, and that the eruption of Toba was one of the most severe environmental challenges our species has ever faced. We carry the scars of that bottleneck in our very DNA, a ghostly reminder written into every cell of every human being alive today that there was a time when our species nearly blinked out of existence. Now let us jump ahead tens of thousands of years to a period when humans had spread across every continent except Antarctica, had developed agriculture, had built cities and civilizations, and had begun to think of themselves as the masters of the natural world. The year was 1347, and across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, life was proceeding as it always had. Farmers tended their fields, merchants plied the trade routes, and kings waged their petty wars. No one could have known that in the holds of a handful of ships sailing from the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a horror was stirring that would reshape the course of human history. The Black Death, as it would come to be called, was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a microscopic organism that was carried by fleas that lived on rats, though more recent research has suggested that human body lice and fleas may have also played a significant role in spreading the disease, particularly in the cooler climates of northern Europe, where rat fleas are less prevalent. The plague had been spreading along the trade routes of Central Asia for years, and there is evidence that it had already devastated communities in China and the Middle East before it reached European shores. Genetic analysis has confirmed that the strain of Yersinia pestis responsible for the Black Death is the ancestor of virtually all strains of plague that cause disease in humans today, meaning that the origin of modern plague epidemics lies in this medieval catastrophe. In one of history's most chilling episodes of early biological warfare, the Mongol army besieging Kaffa reportedly catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the city walls, though it is also likely that infected rats crossed the siege lines on their own. When Genoese traders fled the doomed city by ship, they carried the plague with them to the great ports of the Mediterranean. In October of 1347, 12 ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina, and when onlookers gathered on the docks, they were greeted by a nightmarish sight. Most of the sailors were already dead, and those who were still alive were covered in dark, oozing boils the size of eggs. Sicilian authorities frantically ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The plague had arrived in Europe. The disease spread with a speed and ferocity that defied understanding. Within months, it had swept through Italy, France, and Spain. By the following year, it had reached Paris, Bordeaux, and London. By 1350, it had crossed into Scandinavia and pushed deep into Eastern Europe. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims developed painful swellings in their lymph nodes, called buboes, which turned black and began to ooze blood and pus. Fever, Chills, vomiting, and delirium followed, and most people who showed symptoms were dead within 3 to 5 days. There were 3 forms of the plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, and the pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, could be spread directly through the air, from the cough of one person to the breath of another. The death toll was almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that between 1347 and 1352, the Black Death killed between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone, which represented somewhere between 30 and 60% of the continent's entire population. Some cities lost 2/3 of their inhabitants. Parish records from London show that at the height of the epidemic, 800 bodies were being buried each day. The speed at which the plague moved was staggering even by modern standards, traveling at a rate of 1.5 to 6 kilometers per day across Europe, faster than any human epidemic in the 20th century, including the 1918 influenza pandemic. In some rural areas, entire villages were wiped out, their fields left to grow wild, and their homes slowly reclaimed by nature. Travelers passing through the countryside would find nothing but silence, empty houses with doors swinging open, livestock wandering unattended, and crops rotting in the fields because there was no one left alive to harvest them. Globally, the plague is estimated to have reduced the world's population from approximately 475 million to somewhere between 350 and 375 million. In the Chinese province of Hubei, the death rate was estimated at 80%. In some parts of Gaza and Syria, entire rural provinces were recorded as being totally depopulated. The social fabric of Europe tore apart. People turned on each other, searching for someone to blame. Thousands of Jewish people were massacred in pogroms across the continent, accused of poisoning wells. Groups of religious zealots called the Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in a desperate attempt to appease what they believed was God's wrath. The medical profession, such as it was utterly helpless. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing that the disease was transmitted by foul-smelling air. Some cities attempted rudimentary quarantine measures, but the plague moved faster than any human response could contain it. It would take nearly 80 years for Europe's population to begin recovering, and in some areas, the population did not return to pre-plague levels for more than 150 years. The Black Death did not, of course, come close to ending the human species entirely. Even at its worst, it left hundreds of millions of people alive around the world. But its impact was so profound, so destabilizing, and so psychologically traumatic that it permanently altered the trajectory of Western civilization. Labor shortages drove up wages for the survivors, serfdom began to crumble, and the authority of both the church and secular governments was fundamentally questioned. The plague also never truly went away. It returned in waves for centuries, killing 100,000 people in London alone during the Great Plague of 1665, and more than 100,000 in Moscow in 1770. And the bacterium that caused it, Yersinia pestis, is still with us today, endemic in rodent populations in parts of Madagascar, Congo, and the American Southwest. It is a reminder that even in an age of antibiotics and modern medicine, the microbes that share our world have not forgotten how to kill. The Black Death was devastating, but it was not the last time a pathogen would threaten to fundamentally reshape human civilization. More than 5 centuries later, in the waning days of the First World War, another invisible enemy emerged that would prove even more destructive in some ways than the horrors of the trenches. In the spring of 1918, soldiers at Fort Riley in Kansas began falling ill with what seemed like a particularly severe strain of influenza. The camp was a sprawling military installation where thousands of young men lived in crowded barracks, shared mess halls, and trained in close quarters, conditions that were essentially a petri dish for respiratory infections. Within a week of the first cases, more than 500 men at the camp had been hospitalized, and the disease was spreading rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions of military life. Similar outbreaks were reported at military camps in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and California. But in the fog of war, with the nation's attention fixed on the Western Front, few people paid much attention. The first wave of what would become known as the Spanish flu was relatively mild, causing high fevers and body aches, but relatively few deaths. Military officials dismissed it as a seasonal nuisance and continued shipping troops by the thousands across the Atlantic into the killing fields of France. But by the late summer of 1918, something had changed. The virus had mutated, and the second wave that struck in the fall was catastrophically lethal. Unlike typical strains of influenza, which primarily kill the very young and the very old, this version targeted otherwise healthy adults in the prime of their lives, those between the ages of 20 and 40. It was the most perverse and terrifying feature of the pandemic that the strongest and healthiest were the most vulnerable. The disease attacked the lungs with a ferocity that stunned physicians. At Camp Devens in Massachusetts, 6 days after the first case was reported, there were already 6,674 cases. Patients who seemed healthy in the morning could be dead by nightfall, their skin turning a ghastly shade of blue or purple, a condition the medical staff called heliotrope cyanosis, as their lungs filled with fluid and they essentially drowned from the inside. Autopsies revealed lungs so saturated with blood and fluid that they weighed several times their normal weight. In some cases, the immune response triggered by the virus was so violent that it destroyed the body's own tissues, a phenomenon now known as a cytokine storm. The stronger the immune system, the more violently it responded, which is why young, healthy adults were so disproportionately affected. More American soldiers died from the flu than were killed in battle during the entire war, and 40% of the United States Navy was struck by the illness. The pandemic spread across the globe with terrifying speed, carried by troop ships and trade vessels to every inhabited corner of the planet. It reached North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, and even remote islands in the Pacific. India was particularly devastated, with somewhere between 12 and 17 million deaths, representing roughly 5% of the country's population. The decade between 1911 and 1921 was the only census period in which India's population actually declined, almost entirely due to the influenza pandemic. In the Bristol Bay region of Alaska, populated by indigenous communities, the death rate reached 40%, and some villages were entirely wiped out. Worldwide, the virus infected an estimated 500 million people, roughly 1/3 of the entire global population at the time. The death toll is still debated by historians and epidemiologists. Early estimates place the number at around 20 million, but more recent research has revised that figure dramatically upward. The most commonly cited estimate today is approximately 50 million deaths worldwide, though some researchers believe the true figure could be as high as 100 million, given the lack of reliable medical record keeping in many parts of the world. In the United States alone, approximately 675,000 people died, more than the country lost in all of the combat deaths of the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. American life expectancy dropped by 12 years in a single year, and yet, despite all of this horror, governments actively downplayed the severity of the pandemic, censoring news reports to maintain wartime morale. Spain, which was neutral in the war and therefore did not censor its press, reported the outbreak freely, which is why the pandemic became misleadingly known as the Spanish flu, even though it almost certainly did not originate there. In the absence of accurate information, people were left to fend for themselves. Schools, theaters, churches, and businesses were shuttered. Citizens were ordered to wear masks. Funeral parlors were overwhelmed, and bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. In some communities, people had to dig graves for their own family members. Mass graves were dug by steam shovels, and bodies were buried without coffins because there simply were not enough to go around. Healthcare workers could not tend the sick because they themselves were ill, and gravediggers could not bury the dead for the same reason. The normal functions of society, the things we take for granted every day, ground to a halt. In one grim irony, the medical establishment itself may have inadvertently increased the death toll. Before the spike in deaths in October 1918, the U.S. Surgeon General and the Journal of the American Medical Association had recommended that patients take aspirin in doses of up to 30 grams per day, a dose now known to be toxic. For comparison, the modern medical consensus is that doses above 4 grams are unsafe. The symptoms of aspirin poisoning include hyperventilation and pulmonary edema, the buildup of fluid in the lungs, and it is now believed that many of the deaths attributed to the flu in October and November of 1918 were actually caused or hastened by aspirin poisoning, a cruel case of the cure being worse than the disease. The pandemic burned itself out by the early months of 1920, but not before it had fundamentally altered the world. The virus that caused it, an H1N1 strain of influenza A, was eventually identified and its genome sequenced from preserved tissue samples decades later. Every influenza pandemic since 1918 has been caused by descendants of that original virus, making the Spanish flu, in the words of one prominent virologist, the mother of all pandemics. It remains the deadliest pandemic in modern history and a stark warning of how quickly and how thoroughly a microscopic organism can bring human civilization to its knees. But the threats to humanity's survival have not always come from nature. Sometimes the greatest danger has come from ourselves, or more specifically, from the terrifying weapons we have created and the fragile human judgment on which the fate of the world has rested. To understand just how close we came to annihilation during the 20th century, we need to travel back to the fall of 1962, to a 13-day period in October that historians regard as the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis began on October 14, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane flying high above Cuba captured photographic evidence that the Soviet Union was secretly constructing nuclear missile sites on the island, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. These were not defensive weapons. The medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles being installed had the capability to strike targets across the entire eastern and central United States, including Washington, D.C., within minutes of launch. The intermediate-range missiles, had they become fully operational, could have reached almost the entire lower 48 states, carrying warheads more than twice as powerful as those on the medium-range variants. After the end of the Cold War, Russian officials revealed a detail that made the crisis even more terrifying in retrospect. At the time the crisis broke out, 162 nuclear weapons were already stationed on Cuban soil, a fact the CIA was completely unaware of. Among these were tactical cruise missiles designed specifically to destroy an invading American force on the beaches, weapons that local Soviet commanders had the authority to use without direct orders from Moscow. President John F. Kennedy convened an emergency meeting of his closest advisors, forming what became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, and for the next 13 days, the most powerful nation on Earth grappled with a decision that could have ended human civilization. The Strategic Air Command raised its alert level to DEFCON 2, the highest level short of actual war, the only time in American history this had ever occurred. Some of Kennedy's advisors, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, pushed aggressively for an immediate airstrike against the missile sites, followed by a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. Kennedy, however, chose a more measured response. On October 22nd, he went on national television to inform the American public of the crisis and announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, designed to prevent Soviet ships from delivering additional military equipment. The message was clear and chilling. Kennedy declared that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. For the next several days, the world held its breath as Soviet ships steamed toward the quarantine line. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomatic communications were exchanged between Washington and Moscow, and both sides edged closer and closer to the unthinkable. But the most dangerous moment of the crisis, and arguably the most dangerous moment in human history, occurred not in the White House or the Kremlin, but beneath the waves of the Caribbean Sea, aboard a sweltering Soviet submarine. On October 27, 1962, a date that has since become known as Black Saturday, a group of 11 United States Navy destroyers and the aircraft carrier USS Randolph detected Soviet submarine B-59 near Cuba. What the Americans did not know, and would not learn for decades, was that B-59 was armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. In fact, all 4 Soviet submarines dispatched to Cuban waters carried nuclear weapons, and their commanders had been given pre-authorization to use them if they believed they were under attack and could not contact Moscow for further orders. The Americans began dropping practice depth charges on the submarine, explosive devices intended to force it to the surface for identification. But inside B-59, the crew had no way of knowing that these were signaling charges rather than an actual attack. Conditions aboard the submarine were nightmarish. The air conditioning had failed, and temperatures inside the hull had soared to nearly 60 degrees Celsius, or about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were rising dangerously, and the 78 crew members were barely able to breathe. They had been out of contact with Moscow for days. Captain Valentin Savitsky, the submarine's commander, was convinced that war had already broken out on the surface. He gave the order to arm the nuclear torpedo and prepare to launch it at the American carrier group. His political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. If the torpedo had been fired, the resulting nuclear detonation would have vaporized the Randolph and its escort ships, killing thousands of American sailors and almost certainly triggering a full-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. But aboard B-59, unlike the other 3 submarines in the flotilla, there was a third officer whose consent was required. Vasily Arkhipov was the chief of staff of the entire submarine brigade, and by a quirk of assignment, he happened to be aboard B-59 for this mission. Arkhipov was no stranger to crisis. Just the year before, in 1961, he had been serving as deputy commander aboard the K-19, one of the Soviet Union's first nuclear-powered submarines, when its reactor coolant system failed in the middle of the North Atlantic. 7 engineers who were ordered to improvise a fix died of acute radiation syndrome within a month, and 15 more crew members died within 2 years. Arkhipov himself was exposed to radiation that may have contributed to the kidney cancer that eventually killed him in 1998. The experience on K-19 had given Arkhipov a profound understanding of what nuclear catastrophe actually looked like up close, and it had tempered his judgment with a caution born not of timidity, but of hard-won experience. His authority aboard B-59 meant that all 3 senior officers had to agree unanimously before the nuclear torpedo could be launched. And Arkhipov refused. In the suffocating heat of that submarine, with explosions shaking the hull and his captain screaming that they needed to fight, Arkhipov kept his composure. He argued that the Americans were not attacking them, but trying to signal them to surface. He insisted that they could not start a war without direct orders from Moscow. The argument went on for hours. Eventually, Savitsky relented. The submarine surfaced, was escorted away by American destroyers, and the immediate crisis passed. The world did not know how close it had come to nuclear annihilation until decades later, when the story of B-59 was finally declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union. In 2002, Thomas Blanton, the director of the U.S. National Security Archive, declared simply that Arkhipov had saved the world. The larger crisis was resolved on October 28th, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a pledge from the United States not to invade the island. In a secret side deal that would not be publicly acknowledged for more than 25 years, the United States also agreed to remove its own Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. But the Cuban Missile Crisis had exposed just how easily the world could slide into catastrophe, and it led directly to the establishment of a teletype hotline between Washington and Moscow, the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and a renewed recognition on both sides that the stakes of the nuclear age were almost incomprehensibly high. And yet, the lessons of October 1962 were almost forgotten just 21 years later, when the world came within minutes of accidental nuclear war once again. The year was 1983, and the Cold War had entered one of its most dangerous phases. President Ronald Reagan had branded the Soviet Union an evil empire and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a program aimed at building space-based weapons capable of intercepting incoming nuclear missiles. The Soviets were deeply alarmed, interpreting these moves as preparations for a possible American first strike. Just 3 weeks before the incident that would nearly end the world, the Soviet military had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian passenger plane that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a United States congressman. The international outcry was fierce, and tensions between the two superpowers were at a fever pitch. It was against this backdrop that, shortly after midnight on September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov reported for duty at the Serpukhov 15 bunker, a top-secret facility located about 60 kilometers south of Moscow. The bunker housed the command center for the Soviet Union's Oko satellite early warning system, a network of orbital sensors designed to detect the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. Petrov was a 44-year-old engineer who had helped develop the computer software that analyzed the satellite data, and he understood the system's capabilities and its limitations better than almost anyone. He was not even supposed to be on duty that night. He was filling in for a colleague who had called in sick, one of those small, seemingly insignificant twists of fate that in retrospect may have determined whether civilization survived. His shift was supposed to be uneventful. Instead, shortly after midnight, the bunker's computer screen suddenly lit up with angry red letters. The system was reporting that a single intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana and was heading directly for the Soviet Union. Then, within minutes, the system detected 4 more missiles. The warning was stark, automatic, and it carried a single, terrifying word displayed across the screen in large letters. Launch. Under Soviet military doctrine, the response to a confirmed incoming nuclear attack was an immediate and compulsory nuclear counterstrike, a retaliatory launch designed to ensure mutual destruction. Petrov was supposed to relay the warning up the chain of command without delay. Had he done so, it is likely that Soviet leadership, already on edge from weeks of escalating tensions, would have authorized a nuclear response. The result, as one Stanford professor later estimated, could have been roughly 100 million people killed on the first day of the war, with the death toll climbing to 1 billion within months. But something did not feel right to Petrov. He had been trained that any genuine American first strike would involve hundreds of simultaneous missile launches, not a handful. 5 missiles seemed like an illogical way to start a nuclear war. Furthermore, the satellite system was still new and had been plagued by technical glitches, and the ground-based radar, which should have confirmed the launch independently, was showing nothing. Petrov had about 10 minutes to make his decision. He chose to report the alert as a false alarm. He was correct. The alarms had been triggered by a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which the satellite sensors had mistaken for the bright flare of missile launches. The error was later corrected, and no missiles had ever been fired. But in those agonizing minutes, with the fate of hundreds of millions of lives resting on his judgment, Stanislav Petrov had chosen to trust his instincts over his machines. He was not rewarded for his decision. Instead, he was initially praised by his superior, General Yuri Votintsev, but then quietly reprimanded for failing to properly document the incident in the military diary. The incident was classified, and Petrov was reassigned to a less sensitive post. He took early retirement and lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity in a small apartment outside Moscow. The story did not become public until the late 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when former Soviet officials began discussing previously classified incidents. When the full details emerged, Petrov was hailed around the world as the man who saved the world, though he himself was characteristically modest about it. In an interview, he once said simply that he was the right person at the right time, and that he was just doing his job. He died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77, and his death received far less attention than it deserved. The incident he averted was, in the words of nuclear security expert Bruce Blair, the closest the world had ever come to accidental nuclear war, and remarkably, the Petrov incident was not even the only time in 1983 that the world came close to nuclear catastrophe. Just weeks later, in November, NATO conducted a military exercise codenamed Able Archer 83, which simulated a coordinated nuclear response to a hypothetical Soviet attack. The exercise featured elements specifically designed to test command and control procedures, including realistic communication protocols, and a simulated escalation through DEFCON levels that the Soviets had never seen before in a training exercise. KGB observers in Western Europe reported the unusual activity to Moscow, and paranoia within the Soviet leadership reached a critical threshold. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, already gravely ill and deeply suspicious of American intentions, was convinced that the West was preparing for a real nuclear first strike, disguised as a military exercise. He authorized the mobilization of entire military divisions. Nuclear weapons were transported to their launch sites, and bomber aircraft carrying nuclear warheads were scrambled and placed on runway alert. The nuclear briefcase, the Russian equivalent of the American football, was placed beside Andropov's bed. It was only when a high-ranking American intelligence officer named Leonard Perutz, stationed in Europe, noticed the Soviet mobilization and made what the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board later described as a fortuitous, if ill-informed, decision not to raise Western alert levels in response, that the crisis gradually de-escalated. Had Perutz matched the Soviet escalation with an American one, the feedback loop of fear and suspicion could easily have spiraled out of control. Neither side had fired a shot, but the machinery of Armageddon had been spinning up, and it had almost been too late to shut it down. The full extent of the danger posed by Able Archer 83 was not understood by Western intelligence agencies until years later, when Soviet defectors and newly declassified documents revealed just how close the Soviet leadership had come to interpreting the exercise as cover for an actual attack. It remains one of the most chilling examples of how easily miscommunication and paranoia can bring the world to the edge of destruction. Now, let us journey back further in time once more, to a period when human civilization was still in its infancy, to an event that is still being pieced together by scientists, and that remains one of the most debated catastrophes in the study of our ancient past. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was in the midst of a warming trend. The last great ice age was winding down. Glaciers were retreating across North America and Europe, and humans were thriving. In North America, the Clovis people had developed a sophisticated tool-making tradition, crafting elegant spear points that allowed them to hunt the giant megafauna that still roamed the continent: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. It was a world on the verge of transformation, and then, without warning, temperatures plummeted. This sudden reversal, known as the Younger Dryas, plunged much of the northern hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions for more than 1,200 years. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in just a few years, a pace of cooling so rapid that it would have been perceptible within a single human lifetime. Across Europe, the warming trend that had allowed forests to reclaim Scandinavia was abruptly reversed, and the landscape reverted to Arctic tundra. The event takes its name from a small white wildflower called Dryas octopetala, which thrives in cold conditions and whose fossilized pollen suddenly became abundant in European sediments dating to this period. Ecosystems collapsed. More than 35 genera of large animals in North America went extinct during or shortly after this period, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, American lions, short-faced bears, and saber-toothed cats. The Clovis culture, whose distinctive spear points had been found at archaeological sites across the continent, vanished from the archaeological record, and some studies suggest a dramatic 52% decline in the frequency of Clovis artifacts coinciding with the onset of the cooling. The traditional explanation for the Younger Dryas has been that the failure of glacial ice dams released a massive flood of fresh water from Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation and triggering the cooling. But in 2007, a team of scientists proposed a far more dramatic hypothesis. They suggested that a fragmented comet or asteroid had struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago, triggering widespread wildfires, an impact winter, and the abrupt cooling that defined the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as it became known, remains controversial. Its proponents point to the presence of unusual microscopic materials found in sediment layers, dating to the onset of the Younger Dryas, at dozens of sites around the world, including tiny spheres of iron and silica-rich glass, nanodiamonds, elevated concentrations of platinum and iridium, and vast quantities of soot and charcoal consistent with continent-scale burning. Some estimates suggest that as much as 10% of the planet's total biomass may have burned during this period. The discovery in 2018 of the Hiawatha crater in Greenland, a 31-kilometer-wide impact structure buried beneath the ice sheet, added fuel to the hypothesis, though the crater's exact age is still being determined. Critics, however, have pushed back forcefully. A comprehensive review published in 2023 concluded that there is no support for the idea that human populations were diminished, or that megafaunal extinctions were caused by a cosmic catastrophe. Many experts argue that the microscopic particles cited as evidence can be explained by terrestrial processes, including volcanism, and that the megafaunal extinctions were driven by a combination of climate change and human overhunting. Statistical analysis has shown that the Younger Dryas was merely the last of approximately 25 or 26 rapid climate oscillations, known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events, that occurred over the past 120,000 years, suggesting that while its cooling was dramatic, it may not have required an extraordinary explanation. The conventional and still widely accepted theory is that the failure of glacial ice dams released a massive pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic, disrupting the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great ocean conveyor belt that carries warm water northward and plays a critical role in regulating the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. When that circulation shut down, so did the warming, and temperatures plummeted. The scientific community remains divided, and the debate continues. But what is not in dispute is that the Younger Dryas was a real and dramatic climatic event that had profound consequences for both animal and human populations. Whether it was triggered by a comet or by internal processes within the Earth's climate system, it pushed early human civilizations to the edge and forced dramatic changes in how our ancestors lived, hunted, and fed themselves. Some researchers have even suggested that the environmental stress of the Younger Dryas may have been the catalyst that drove certain human populations toward agriculture, as the unreliability of wild food sources made the cultivation of crops an increasingly attractive alternative. If that theory is correct, then the very foundations of human civilization, the farms and granaries and settled communities that eventually gave rise to cities and empires, may owe their existence to a catastrophe that nearly wiped us out. And so, as we look back across the vast sweep of time, from the earliest bombardments of our young planet to the nuclear close calls of the 20th century, a pattern emerges. Again and again, life on Earth has been pushed to the brink by forces both external and internal, by asteroids screaming in from outer space, by supervolcanoes tearing the planet open from within, by invisible pathogens spreading silently through the air, and by the weapons we have built with our own hands. Each time, survival has hinged on a combination of luck, resilience, and in some cases, the courage and judgment of a single individual. The margins have often been razor thin. A Soviet officer choosing not to fire a nuclear torpedo in the sweltering darkness of a submarine. a satellite glitch caused by nothing more than sunlight reflecting off clouds, mistaken for the fiery plume of incoming missiles. A quirk of genetics that allowed a handful of our ancestors to survive a volcanic winter that blotted out the sun. A coastline rich enough in shellfish and marine life to sustain a few thousand desperate survivors while the interior of an entire continent froze. We are here not because we were destined to survive, but because at each of these critical junctures, something or someone tipped the balance just enough to let us keep going. The universe is vast and indifferent, and it has tried to kill us more times than we can count. And yet here we are, alive, aware, and telling the story of our own survival to each other in the dark. If you found these stories as haunting and thought-provoking as I did, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does make a huge difference and helps us keep telling these incredible stories. Until next time, sleep well, and remember how unlikely and precious your existence truly is.